Yeah, so I was born in London in the 1960s, and I grew up in the 1970s, which was a very violent time in England. It was the time of football hooliganism, but it was also a time of youth cults such as punks and skinheads, but also politics. And I got very heavily involved in radical politics with a white supremacist organisation called the National Front, which I joined when I was 15 years old, and rose in the ranks of that very quickly and became the youngest member of its executive council when I was about 18 or 19. So I came from religiously, we were agnostic. I suppose my parents might have said they were Christian if you asked them, but we never went to church. We never prayed. Weddings and funerals, the only time we would darken the face of a church. So I was effectively an agnostic and a very angry, racist young man during my youth. My childhood it was spent in a small market town in Suffolk in England, a rural shire, very agricultural, and so we spent lots of time playing in cornfields and in local woods. And one of the local woods was called Lady Wood, and so we thought in our imagination that this was haunted by a lady, a medieval lady. Of course, we understood nothing about England's Catholic history, being ignorant of such things, because Lady Wood, of course, was called Lady Wood because it was Our Lady's wood. And there was an old monastery in town, and we thought that was haunted by evil monks. So we sort of imbibed subconsciously, because we weren't religious. We'd imbibed subconsciously this sort of psychological anti-Catholicism. Every November the 5th, there was something called Guy Fawkes Night or Bonfire Night, and that was when every year they would burn an effigy of Guy Fawkes. Now, Guy Fawkes was someone who was condemned to death for his part in the gunpowder plot in 1605, a plot by Catholics to blow up Parliament. And that was because Catholics by this stage had basically been being put to death in England for about 70 years. Around England, they still burn an effigy of this Catholic on bonfires. So that was part of our childhood. And certainly a bit later on, when I was involved in politics, and I was very anti-Catholic in a political sense now, not really in an ignorant sense, that we went, there's a place in Lewes in Sussex where every year they don't just burn Guy Fawkes, they burn the Pope. They have two bonfires. They burned the Pope on one, and not just a Pope, it was the current Pope, so it looked like St. John Paul II that was being burned. And then also whoever's particularly unpopular, normally a politician. So that particular year in Lewes when I went there, would have been the early 80s, was St. John Paul II on one bonfire and Ronald Reagan on the other. So that was the sort of bigoted culture in which I was raised. I had a very good relationship with my father, and this is one of the hardest things about writing my book Race with the Devil, was coming to terms with my relationship with my father and coming to terms with needing to be honest about the way I spoke about it. Which is one of the reasons the book wasn't written while my father was alive, because that would have been like a raw nerve. But I was very close with my father right at the end. He was a very loving father. He loved Shakespeare. He could quote swathes of Shakespeare. Loved British history, loved geography, but he was also a racist. He very much resented the demographic changes that were happening in the United Kingdom. He remembers before World War One, where basically that England was a monocultural, monoracial society, and then through the 50s and 60s, he saw the changing face of England, should we say, and he resented it. So I grew up in the 1960s, literally at my father's knee as a child, being raised as a racist, and also being raised to be very anti-Catholic. My father used to call Catholics bead rattlers, those who rattled their beads, and so I sort of grew up being anti-Catholic and a racist. So when I got involved in politics, it was very much a racist and anti-Catholic brand of politics, because as well as being a white supremacist, I was also involved with the anti-Catholic terrorist organisations in Northern Ireland, such as the UDA and the UVF, the Ulster Defence Association and the Ulster Volunteer Force. Yeah, so basically when I reached adolescence, I remember as a 14-year-old writing swastikas on my school books at school. I got caned, corporal punishment at school for carving NF, which was the initials of National Front, the neo-Nazi organization I would join about a year later. So I became very angry and very, very, very monomaniacal. I mean, it was the only thing I was really fixated on. So I went looking for a National Front march I'd heard about, and came across some National Front paper sellers, and then found out how to join. And I had to lie about my age, because at that point you had to be 16 to join. I was only 15. They later lowered it to 14 anyway. So I became very heavily involved from the age of 15.
And what does that look like? What does it look like for a 15-year-old to be part of the National Front?
Well, weekly newspaper selling, but of the National Front's newspaper, and then when I started editing the youth magazine Bulldog, then that would be being sold around the country as well. And that would often end up in violence, because there were Trotskyite organizations, so communist organizations, the Socialist Workers' Party in particular, who would attack our paper sellers, or we'd attack their paper sellers. So, that fighting and violence was part and parcel of the whole lifestyle. We had marches, and when we held marches, the Socialist Worker Party or the Anti-Nazi League would have counter demonstrations, and there'd be bricks and glass thrown, and lots of people getting injured. Not many killed, but there was I think two communists and one of my friends were killed in these violent demonstrations in England. Apart from the two killed in Northern Ireland, one was blown up in a car bomb when he was about to deliver, ironic Christmas morning, about to deliver turkeys to political prisoners, because he's involved with the UDA, paramilitary organization, a terrorist organization. But they planted the car bomb, so when he hit the ignition, he was blown up. And another friend of mine was shot. And then the ones that my friend in England was hit in the head with a brick, and that subsequently killed him. So they were violent times, and there were certain situations I look back on. It's only by the grace of God that I'm still here. Quite frankly, I could not very easily have not got beyond my teenage years. So I founded the youth magazine Bulldog when I was 16, and the first issue came out, I think it was in August or September of 1977. And immediately, within the first couple of issues, it made national headlines, because the photographs of people and films of people selling this magazine outside high schools was a volatile news story. So it made the national headlines. Well, from my perspective, that was great news. The circulation of the magazine became a national circulation, and sort of went up tenfold in the space of a few weeks. Everybody wanted copies of it, so I became a bit of a national celebrity, infamous in the eyes of the secular world, but a hero within the ghetto in which I moved. So that magazine became the national newspaper of the Young National Front, and I became chairman of the Young National Front, so the youth movement. And so I carried on editing that magazine, Bulldog, and then in 1982, the beginning of 1982, I was sentenced to 6 months in prison for editing the magazine, because it was deemed likely to incite racial hatred in contravention of the Race Relations Act in England. And I spent 4 months of a 6-month prison sentence, spent my 21st birthday in prison. I got out of prison, carried on editing the magazine, but because I didn't want to go straight back to prison, and I wasn't prepared to water things down, the editor became someone called Captain Truth. So there's a picture on the cover is a huge chest with a big T and masks. The British police force might not be the smartest people in the world, but they figured out eventually that Captain Truth didn't exist. And so consequently, at about 3 o'clock in the morning, one middle of the night, my house was raided, and they found all the evidence they needed that I was in fact Captain Truth, and I was editing the magazine still. I was charged a second time, and this time sentenced to 12 months in prison, and spent 6 months of that 12-month sentence and spent my 25th birthday in prison. But there's a big difference between the two prison sentences, because the first one, I was an absolute rabid, racist, revolutionary, and I shouted at the judge that he would face his judgment, and they dragged me off to the cells, and I was just angry and defiant and considered myself to be a political soldier, and used my cell as a gym to get myself in shape so I come out and be worse than ever. But by the second prison sentence, I thought, what am I doing here? Because basically I'm living a lie. I haven't believed this stuff for a while now. I've been going through the motions, and now here I am on the beginning of a 12-month prison sentence for something I don't even really believe in anymore. And that was because between the two prison sentences, between 1982 and end of 1985, I'd been reading a lot of Catholic authors such as G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire, Belloc, discovering C.S. Lewis. And then during that second prison sentence, I read Thomas Aquinas for the first time. And I also read a book called Apologetics and Catholic Doctrine by Archbishop Sheehan, who was an Australian archbishop. And that was used widely in Catholic schools up to the 1950s. But it was just a brilliant, Fides et Ratio, faith and reason. First part of the book was does God exist, just through reason? And then, second part, if God does exist, could he reveal himself? Yes. Has he revealed himself? Yes. And then you get into apologetics and theology, and that completely blew me away. And I read another book that was very important, I think just after I got out of prison, shortly before I was received into the church, but it remained very important to me, is Carl Adams' Spirit of Catholicism, because that taught me about what the Catholic Church as being not a human institution, but in actual fact the mystical body of Jesus Christ, and that the largest part of the church is the church triumphant in heaven. And the part that we're members of, the church militant, is just the smallest part, and each of us is just here to do a relatively short tour of active service as Miles Christi, soldiers of Christ, in the church militant, the church at war, in order to cross the finishing line and be part of the church triumphant, where there is no evil, where there is no defeat, because the victory has already been won. And when I understood the Catholic Church in those terms, right, that what's happening in this world, as long as we're true to Christ, right, and by the grace of God have the courage to remain true to our convictions and to following him, there's nothing to worry about. Under grace, obviously to God be the glory, but under grace, Chesterton was the single most important influence upon my conversion. So I often say when I'm giving my conversion story in a speech, in a talk, that I thank God for giving me Chesterton, and I thank Chesterton for giving me God. So there's a great deal of thanksgiving in my biography of Chesterton, which is the first book I wrote as a Catholic. It was my biography of Chesterton. Nobody would have persuaded me to read a book by G.K. Chesterton because of my anti-Catholicism and my anti-Christianity. Chesterton was, of course, a Catholic author, and no one would get me to read a Catholic book. But evidently, I was interested in politics and economics. So when we had our marches on the streets and we had the extreme left, the communists attacking us, apart from physically attacking us, they would attack us verbally. And one of the things they would say is, you're just the stormtroopers of capitalism. And my view was, well, I might not like communism, but it doesn't mean I want the world run by Bill Gates, or not that he was around then, but whoever the 1970s and 80s equivalent was of Bill Gates, global corporations, multinational corporations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, what we would now call globalist institutions. I didn't believe in globalism, and therefore I didn't believe in capitalism in that sense. So I was looking for alternatives. Right, and so someone said, well, have you looked at the distributist ideas of G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc? And I said, no, who are they? No. And they said, well, you need to read one particular essay by Chesterton called Reflections on a Rotten Apple, and it's in a book called The Well and the Shallows. So here I go and buy this book. I'm poor, by the way. Full-time revolutionaries are not paid very much. But I'm poor, and I remember this is back in 1980, I think. I paid £12, which is a lot of money then, probably half my week's salary, quite frankly, for a copy of this. I still have it behind me there, a copy of The Well and the Shallows. Now, for that one essay, and the essay is 2/3 of the way through, and I thought, well, if this person's, I've just spent £12, right? If these persons must be worth reading, I'll get to the essay when I get to it. I'll begin reading from page 1, so I was reading. Of course, The Well and the Shallows, the well in the title of the book is the Catholic Church, which has depth, profundity, life-giving water. The shallows is everything else. So that's the metaphor for the book. Because I'm reading it all, I'm not agreeing with it all, and I don't. I didn't become a convert to Catholicism overnight, but when I get to the essay on Reflection on a Rotten Apple, it blows me away, and I think Chesterton absolutely has it right. This is what I've been looking for. This is the right approach to global economic and political problems. And I didn't realise, of course, that his ideas were the ideas of the Catholic Church, that he and Belloc got those ideas from Rerum Novarum, an encyclical by Pope Leo XIII, 1891. So, because I came to realise that, and the rest of the Catholics, well, I don't agree with it, but I can't help liking G.K. Chesterton. I can't help liking his personality, his sense of humour, the way he writes, most of his ideas, except for the Christian stuff. So, and then I picked up a book in a second-hand bookshop in London by an author called C.S. Lewis. And I'd heard of C.S. Lewis, but I had no idea he was Christian. I think all I knew about C.S. Lewis, he'd written one book for children called The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and I'd never read it, I had no idea what it was about, and that was all I knew about him. But something prompted me, and I have to think it's the Holy Spirit. Something prompted me to take this book out of all the hundreds of others I could have taken from the shelf, from the shelf, and I opened it at random and saw the word Chesterton. So now I'm interested. And this is where C.S. Lewis gives his description of first reading Chesterton. And at the time, it's during World War One. He's in the British Army. He's recovering in a field hospital in France. And he's an atheist and a cynic. And he said, you would have thought that Chesterton would be the least conducive of authors for someone like me, But I started reading Chesterton and couldn't help liking him. So now I'm thinking, well, Lewis is an atheist. He's not a Christian. That's good. He likes Chesterton. That's better. And then he says at the end of it that Chesterton had more common sense than all the moderns put together, except, of course, his Christianity. And I thought, yes, C.S. Lewis is brilliant. That's exactly it. So then I buy the book by C.S. Lewis. So I find out who he is. And of course, that book is Surprised by Joy, which is C.S. Lewis's conversion story. So as I'm reading, I'm thinking, oh no, I don't like where this is going. And of course, then Lewis becomes a Christian. Now Lewis becomes another favourite author. So I'm buying everything I can get my hands on by G.K. Chesterton, everything I can get my hands on by Hilaire Belloc, everything I can get my hands on now by C.S. Lewis. And of course, now I'm immersing myself in this very, very good Catholic philosophy and theology, beautifully written, and falling in love with the personalities of these three authors, so they're almost becoming friends. So now I'm feeling that I actually might not agree with everything they say, but I'd much rather be with them than with the people I'm hanging out with. And so I just spend a lot more time with them, but hanging out, reading them all the time. So by the time I went to prison the second time, I thought, well, I actually don't even believe this stuff. I believe this. And of course, then going to that second prison sentence, plenty of time to start reading. As I've said, I started reading Thomas Aquinas. I read Newman's Apologia Pro Vita Sua in prison there. And I read the Lord of the Rings for the first time. I've been meaning to read the Lord of the Rings for forever, but it's that thick, and you're busy. Well, now you're in prison, plenty of time in your hands. Now's the time to read it. Of course, and I discovered that Tolkien is a lifelong practicing Catholic, friend of C.S. Lewis. It seems that all my favourite writers are Catholics, or at least fellow travellers like C.S. Lewis. And this is the world that I have I've begun to inhabit, where I feel at home. And then Chesterton particularly, first of all, obviously Aquinas later and Newman, taught me the indissoluble marriage between fides et ratio, between faith and reason. Now, my generation, I think that it's still probably true of the culture, you have to choose between the comforts of religion or the hard-nosed facts of reality, right? You either have to be a realist or religious. If you're religious, you get the comforts of religion, but only by being superstitious and unrealistic. Or you can embrace the hard realities of life, but only by abandoning religion. And of course, by reading Chesterton, I realised, on the contrary, right, that faith and reason are united. And if you separate them, your reason becomes irrational very quickly, and your faith becomes irrational, heretical very quickly. The only way that you actually keep faith and reason together is to have them united, and that's been united from the time of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas. So this whole core of the mind, if you like, of Western civilization. So once I realized that on the contrary, not only is religion not superstitious, it's all this Enlightenment stuff, which is ultimately superstitious, that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, the baby Jesus out with the bathwater, and they've got nothing but dirty water left. So when I got out of prison the second time, I knew that I had to make a clean break. I couldn't go back to the old life in the old radical politics. And the only reason, by the way, that I'd carried on going through the motions for so long is you can imagine that inside the ghetto, inside the movement, I'm a hero. Right, in for the first prison sentence, I got about 10,000 birthday cards for my 21st birthday. The prison authorities, you're only supposed to get, I think, 3 a day, and they were giving me a few more and a few more than that. But at some point, they just said to me, "Come with us," and they had a room upstairs, a cell upstairs. And they just emptied out a sack and said, "You've got 2 hours." And they just locked me in there to look through all of these. So I'm a hero inside the movement, and I'm a pariah outside, right? I'm about as bad as you can be to the general public. So it's much easier to remain inside the walls of the ghetto as a hero than to step out into the unknown where you're going to become anathema, and also demonized by your old friends who won't like you anymore, and not liked by any new friends, but if you can make them because of your past. So I went through the motions because I found myself, if you like, trapped. But when I got out of prison the second time, I started to go to mass during that second prison sentence, and I knew that I had to make a clean break, and that meant leaving London and moving to a relative backwater of England, an agricultural area in Norfolk. So I moved to Norfolk, and got myself my first really 9-to-5 regular secular job, because I'd basically been a full-time revolutionary since I was 15. I spent several years in the 9-to-5 world, but during this period, and most importantly, was received into the Catholic Church on St. Joseph's Day in 1989 at a church in Norwich in England. And that, of course, Maurice Spearing, a great Catholic novelist, convert, poet, friend of Chesterton, Maurice Spearing, he said of his own conversion that it was the one thing in his life which has always been completely sure he has never regretted. I'm tempted to say the same, but as I'm married, I think that I have to say that there's at least 2, right? My wedding day and the day I was received into the church. But there's obviously the most important moment in your life is to come into communion with the mystical body of Jesus Christ. So from 1989 onwards, I've been a practicing Catholic, obviously still practicing in the sense that they're not trying to get better at it. It's an ongoing pilgrimage. As I get older, my eyes are much more set on the finishing line, and so trying to keep myself in shape so I can get across the finishing line in good shape. But try to practice what I call a healthy trinity ever since then, which is to find time every day for spiritual exercise, physical exercise, and intellectual exercise. Now, my work takes care of the intellectual exercise. I don't have to worry about that, but I still make a point, or try to make a point every day of finding time for spiritual and physical exercise. So that's been part of my life since I became a Catholic. And then, of course, when my first book was published, my biography of Chesterton, I had to make a decision, just to have the extra money and go on a nice holiday somewhere and keep the 9-to-5 job, or to be really radical and give up the day job and try to write another book before the money ran out. And I took the latter option. And so people wondered how I managed to write so many books during the 5 years I was living in England before I moved to the States as a full-time writer. If I didn't write 2 books a year, I wouldn't have a roof over my head. I wouldn't pay the bills. So I had to write 2 books a year just to make ends meet. So it was I was very diligent, very disciplined, and that, of course, then got this body of work, which allowed me to be employed as a faculty member at Ave Maria University, which brought me to the States in 2001. The tragedy is that the Catholic Church has the answers to the world's political and economic problems. I say it's a tragedy. It's not. It's only a tragedy because it's the best kept secret of the church, and it's largely because there are people in the church who think it's best kept secret. But the Catholic Church's social teaching, as made manifest by great popes such as Leo XIII, Pius XI, St. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, is what the two pillars of subsidiarity and solidarity. Basically, the family being the central axiomatic bastion of economic and political liberty. That's subsidiarity, the need to preserve and protect the family from attacks and encroachments upon its liberties. But there's also solidarity, which is the common good. In other words, that all of us, we need to be thinking more about our responsibilities and less about our rights. In fact, the whole language of rights is an Enlightenment idea. Prior to that, it was that which was right and wrong, not that which was right and left. The Catholic Church still has a political philosophy rooted in right and wrong, not right and left, which is why it's not on the right or the left, it's right, as in not wrong, and not as in not left. So it is something which transcends and supersedes ideology. We have to understand that. So what Chesterton and Belloc called distributism, that's an ugly word, and they called it an ugly word. Those of us who are distributists today, such as myself and, for instance, Dal Olquist, the president of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton, we are now using the word localist, because localism really does encapsulate what Chesterton and Belloc and the Catholic Church, Leo XIII, Pius XI, St. John Paul II, have been teaching. That basically the answer to big government is small government, the answer to big business is small business. Now, of course, some business would have to be on the bigger side, but they should be the exception and not the rule. A healthy economy is an economy made up of numerous small businesses, not a handful of big businesses. And healthy politics is where government is held, first of all, in the family, but then power should be devolved away from central government back to local government, and then only devolved upwards from local government. So when things can only be done nationally, that's the job of the national government. If something can be done locally, it should be the job of local government. Taxes should be set by local government and not by central government. And then out of that taxes, the local government will pay the central government to do things the local government can't do. In other words, it's a complete reversal of what we have now, where we have a supersized government getting bigger and bigger. So we're not even talking about national governments anymore. We're talking about international, global institutions running the world. So everything getting bigger and bigger and further away from the people. Now think about democracy, right? Democracy means, at least it should mean, that we have a real say in our political destiny, but we have some real political muscle. Well, if you're one voter in an electorate of several billion, right, you have no power at all. The government is so far away from you, it doesn't care about you. Whereas if you are voting for your local government, which has real power, including the power to tax you, right, you are going to know those politicians because they're local people. They're going to know you, or at least they're going to know someone who knows you, right? It can be that close. And they're going to be responsive, right? It's going to be a real democratic dynamic. So the only way we can get democracy back again is to have a democracy of small places. So local democracy has to be re-empowered, and national governments and global institutions have to have their power taken away from them, except for the handful of things only they can do. Localism just means that you have to change the practice of your own life locally, right? I say to people that you have a vote in elections once every however many years. But you vote with the dollars in your pocket every single day of your life. Every dollar you spend is a vote that's either making the world a better place or a worse place. So we should be voting every day of our lives. And if we were voting every day of our lives with every dollar that we spent, we'd change the world very quickly. So we should be, just give some practical examples of what we try to do. We buy our meat from the local family butcher shop that's owned by a husband and wife. They have about 2 employees. We go to the farmer's market. My wife went there this morning to buy produce. We spend as little money as possible on globalized products, so we don't get the latest gadget. In fact, we have as few gadgets as we can get away with. I call gadgets godgets because we spend more time with our godgets than we do with our God. Our heads are bowed that way mostly over our personal devices. So spend less money on technology, more money on food. if you're going to eat out, go to a family-owned restaurant, or at least a small chain, not a national or global chain. If you're going to go to a coffee shop, avoid the global or national chains and go to a locally owned coffee shop, preferably one run by Christians. There's some around here that 10% of the profit goes to help adoption. So, you know, be thinking about, you don't have to be buying into chain stores or chain restaurants. You can be buying out of that as far as possible. Some things you have no choice, you know, some things you have to go to these big places to get. But where you do have a choice, make it, and make it a wise and virtuous choice. Don't sort of think you've got to buy the cheapest. Buying the cheapest is ruining your children's future. It's the path of least resistance that leads to hell. You've got to be buying ethically and be willing to spend more to do so. And if you don't have the money to do that, spend less somewhere else. And most of us are spending too much on things we don't really need. One of the greatest honors of my life was being able to go to Moscow and meet and interview Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And the story behind that's, you know, somewhat amazing and astonishing for me, really, because you have to understand that Solzhenitsyn had basically banned all Western journalists or writers from his presence. They treated him so badly, he said, well, I'm not talking to any of you again. So I don't think he'd spoken to a Western writer for about 10 years when I write him out of the blue from England. And I'd only published one book at the time, my biography of G.K. Chesterton. And I wrote to him and said that I didn't think that any of the previous biographies of him, the existing biographies of him, had paid due attention to the centrality of his Orthodox faith to his life and beliefs and works. So I'd like to write a biography which would do that. And then by way of a CV, the only thing I had to say was I'd written a biography of G.K. Chesterton. So I send this off, and I don't even remember now where I sent it to and how it got to Solzhenitsyn. But anyway, I sent this, and not expecting to receive a reply, of course. And I thought, well, you know, maybe the best case scenario is a thanks but no thanks signed by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in which case I'll frame it, put it on my wall, and, you know, so that was the best I was hoping for. So imagine my surprise when he writes back and says yes, that he would cooperate with my writing of the biography that I've mentioned, and that I should make arrangements to come to Moscow to interview him. And he introduced me to two of his sons who speak fluent English, asking me to use those as intermediaries. So I was obviously astonished. So waving this letter from Solzhenitsyn, I go down to HarperCollins with my publisher at the time in London. I wave this letter in front of them and say, you have to give me a contract to write this book, and you have to give me an extra £10,000 because I can't afford to go to Moscow unless you do. And so they looked at it, and they were as astonished as I was, and they said, no problem. So I went there, and of course, the mystery for me was, why would he say yes? You know, I thought, but he had to agree that the previous biographies had not paid due attention to his Orthodox beliefs, clearly. But still, you know, why me? I mean, I've written only one book, you know. But when I get to Moscow and I go to his house, the Dakar, out in the countryside in the middle of pine woods, very beautiful. Before he comes down, his wife takes me to another room and shows me a bookcase. And the top shelf of the bookcase is the Ignatius collected works of G.K. Chesterton. She made a point of showing me that. So Chesterton was the magic word that got me, if you like, the key to Solzhenitsyn's presence. So I've already talked about how much I have to be grateful to Chesterton for my conversion, not least of all, but also giving me access to the great Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Again, greatest honor in my life was to meet him, because he was a key figure on my own conversion. Reading the Gulag Archipelago as a young man led me. I was anti-communist, so that's why I liked Solzhenitsyn and read him. But of course, he's much more than that. So you get to see a sort of a philosophy, a way of seeing things that you hadn't thought about before, which is ultimately a Christian way of seeing things. So Solzhenitsyn had another significant influence upon my conversion, alongside G.K. Chesterton, Belloc, and others. So for me, he was an absolute hero. Of course, most of my best friends, I say, are dead. Chesterton was long dead, and Belloc's long dead. Solzhenitsyn was still alive. He was 79 years old when I met him. He lived for another 10 years. But he liked my biography. So, and when he died, his family cooperated with the revised edition, which I took as great endorsement both by him and by his family, that they believe I achieved what I hoped to do in writing that biography that made his Christian faith the central aspect of his life.
Yeah.
I recall a somewhat sad story when I was back visiting England, fairly recently, with a relative of mine, and he was coming out with all these sort of wacky conspiracy theories about the world being run by the Illuminati and these secret societies, and I try to say, well, I know I read a book called World Revolution by Nestor Webster that's that thick about all this, so I know what you're talking about, because I also believed it once, but also I've read other books that have taken me realizing that was wrong. It might be that thick, but it was nonetheless nonsense. But how do I know that? Because I've read other books and I've got a bigger picture through reading books. And he looked at me as if, what have books got to do with it, And I said, well, yeah, why do you believe what you believe then? Well, I saw it on the internet, right? Some podcast or some YouTube video. And in other words, that anybody can say anything wacky now, and because none of us are rooted. This is the problem with relativism. Chesterton said there are only two types of philosophy. There's the philosophy of the tree, which is rooted in reality, in bedrock permanent things. And there's the philosophy of the cloud, which is just blown around by whatever winds of fashion, the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, whatever happens to be happening. And that's what people believe now, because it's a relativism. They have no roots. Whatever somebody tells them, that seems to make sense to them at that moment from where they are, which is going to be somewhere very different from where they're going to be next week, right? They believe it. And now this is the madness in which we're living in now. And you say, well, the only way you can get out of that is to actually engage on a deeper level. Right, so switch off, right? First of all, disconnect from the internet and reconnect to reality by reading good books. And good books that have footnotes that you can actually check that when they say something, they've got a source, which if you really want to be good about it, you can then check the source, right? There's like the tree, right? Now you're going back. You have the flowers here saying this, but you can check it. Look at the trunk of the argument and then go back to the roots of the footnotes. There's a way you can actually test objectively whether what people are saying is true, not just the one who's most persuasive because of the art of rhetoric or sophistry. They completely pull the wool over your eyes and you become some sort of zombie who believes nonsense. Yeah, what I found very, very encouraging this year at Easter is that in both France and England, of course I'm an old world person, I'm from England, I love Catholic Europe, that in France, I think it was 17,000 adult converts came into the church at Easter, which was the largest number since the church started keeping records. But was even better, about 5 or 10 years earlier, the previous time they kept the record, the demographic was, I think, 25 to 45-year-olds was the most common demographic for those received in the church. This time it was 19 to 25-year-olds. So the young people are coming in droves. Same thing in England. I can't remember exact numbers now. I did write about this for Catholic World Report. But I think it was about 11,000, which is, again, I think the largest number of adult converts being received in the church at Easter since the 1950s. So for 70 years. Again, young people. And I find this extremely encouraging. I find a lot of it is connected to the authentic, authoritative orthodoxy. In other words, what they're not looking for is Christianity in water, as C.S. Lewis would say. We don't want modernism. We don't want a church, as Chesterton would say, we don't want a church that will move with the world. We want a church that will move the world. That these young people know there's something very badly wrong with the world in which we're living for all sorts of manifold reasons. And they're looking for something which is more centered with something more real. And they're finding in the Catholic Church. And that's the authentic, authoritative, orthodox Catholic Church. And we need church leaders with the courage to recognize that, which means, of course, having the courage to stand up to the zeitgeist, the toxic mainstream, because it's going to cause of course, the church becoming more seen as the authentic alternative and the authentic opposition to radical secularism and radical relativism.